Welcome back to the Saving Canada podcast. I'm your host, Bartholomew Crenshaw. With me, as always, Jack Newsman, and we have a distinguished guest who's honoring us with his presence, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Many of you listeners have become fans of his because of his very matter-of-fact, to-the-point, and real analysis of Ukraine. And with all the propaganda and crazy videos, there's a lot to sift through to actually get to what's going on. Ton of stuff he's been saying, especially on Fox News and all that, has turned out to be correct analysis, and we're trying to get the best info to you guys out there that we can. Welcome to the show, Douglas Macgregor. And my first question to you is, how much of Russia's objectives have been accomplished already, and what more are they looking for?
Well, it's important to go back and understand what Russia was trying, or what Moscow was trying to achieve when it first went into Ukraine, because that wasn't very clear to many, many people, and how they expected to achieve those aims. I mean, what they really wanted at the outset, and I think up until recently, was, first of all, we'd like Ukraine to be neutral and renounce any intention of joining NATO. Secondly, we'd like them to essentially grant equal rights to the Russians that live on their soil in eastern Ukraine. And that includes autonomy for the two Donbas republics in the east. And then finally, renounce any claim that you've had in the past to Crimea and recognize that it is legitimately part of Russia. Now, those were the things that they wanted. And the way they set about accomplishing or achieving these objectives in their minds was to enter Ukraine on a very broad front with a relatively small force initially. And this small force that operated on about a 450-mile front in battalion tactical group formations was supposed to go in, find Ukrainian forces, try to give them an opportunity to surrender or give up or withdraw. If not, then to fight them, but to otherwise refrain from any use of strike assets that would cause collateral damage in the form of either property damage or kill large numbers of civilians, frankly. They didn't want to kill very many people. And they thought that this approach would have eventually induced the Ukrainian government to negotiate with them. Well, that didn't work. Let's be frank. It was a failure for a number of reasons, one of which was not only did the Ukrainian forces fight, but they pulled immediately into large towns and cities. Ukrainian forces didn't come out to meet them, didn't maneuver against them. There was nothing going on the operational level in terms of orchestrating counter offensives. So the Russians were then compelled to surround these towns and cities and begin the process of essentially reducing the enemy inside these built-up areas. Secondly, the Russian population in eastern Ukraine stayed neutral initially. The reason for that was very simple, because the Russians said, look, we're here. Why aren't you working with us? And the answer was, well, you said that once you completed your mission and destroyed the Ukrainian forces, you were going to leave. They said, you know, that's unacceptable. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, what's the point of helping you? You come in here to help us and then you leave. The Ukrainian secret police shows up after you're gone and shoots all of us and our families in the head, and we're dead. So if you're not going to come in here, liberate us and stay, then forget it. We're not helping you. Well, all of that has changed, obviously, over the last month or so, because the Russians realized the Ukrainians were not negotiating in good faith. They discovered that we and London in particular were both urging Zelensky to fight to the last Ukrainian, making promises of all types and kinds and pouring aid and assistance into the place. And essentially the Ukrainian forces in the east were told to hold whatever they could hold and fight to the bitter end. And that's what I think a large number of Ukrainian troops have done. But now this whole thing has finally collapsed because the Ukrainians never had the mobility, they never had the firepower, they never had the logistical infrastructure to really make the fight in eastern Ukraine against the Russians. And the Russians, of course, finally took the gloves off and discovered that they were going to have to hammer many of these towns and cities beyond the level that they had originally planned for. So now Ukrainian resistance has collapsed. There is, as far as I can tell, no command and control, not that there was much to begin with. And Ukrainian forces are asking, for help, or saying, if you can't help us, since we've been reduced by 60, 70% strength, That means they're down to roughly a quarter or a third of what they were originally. Then let us withdraw. Let us get out of here. We can't fight any longer. If we do, we're just going to be annihilated. And apparently there's been no change in the attitude in Kyiv, and they're continuing to tell them to hold. It's a very tragic situation. And I think we're going to discover down the line that tens of thousands of people have been killed unnecessarily in a way that made no sense, that could have been avoided if a negotiated settlement had been treated as genuinely desirable by the West and by the Ukrainian government that allegedly represents its people. I don't really think it does.
Yeah, and Zelensky is pretty famous. His name's all over the Panama Papers. It's a very corrupt country. So there's, I've got my suspicions. I think Jack as well. That they can use this Ukraine war. I mean, if it ends suddenly, then they can't keep getting billions of dollars shipped and disappeared in Ukraine. Do you think that's a concern?
Well, there's a theory that a lot of money laundering has been going on because, frankly, remember, we're not simply shipping money there, though we have shipped a lot. A lot of the money went to pay the bureaucracy, pay the so-called Ukrainian government, whatever that means. And as you say, it's incredibly corrupt and hardly the pristine liberal democracy that's being portrayed in the West. And I think you've also seen a lot of money that has simply been sort of rotated from Washington to Ukraine and then back to Washington to the pockets of people that are shareholders in the defense industry, to donors, to Congress. So it's a corruption machine. It's a legalized form of corruption, but nevertheless, it's a corruption machine in progress.
What we've noticed is that pretty much all the lies that are there, you know what I mean? Like how the media portray things, the more we look into it, the more it's just, completely seems like the opposite, from what we were seeing kind of early onset, from, again, even what Russia's intentions were to what they were portraying, on our Western media. It was just completely the opposite from our perspective. We noticed also that there's this drawing of, it seemed like foreign mercenaries from all around the world, and this appeal to young men to go over and fight with these, to defend Ukrainians' honor. And so it seemed like there was a lot of, I guess, international forces being drawn in there. And then, God knows what happens once you're stuck in there. But we noticed that as well, that they were moving into this kind of guerrilla style tactics in the cities, which, again, you mentioned would inevitably slow down any Russian force, right? Especially if their intentions were to limit casualties, right?
Well, of course. And again, I think the Russian perception and Putin's guidance were both not aligned with the reality that they ultimately confronted. But there's something else to keep in mind, and this is the idea that there can be an insurgency, the notion that now that we should turn what remains of Ukraine into what people in Washington call Ukrainistan. In other words, make it into some sort of Afghanistan-like fight for the Russians. Well, that's utter nonsense. First of all, most of Ukraine that we're dealing with is rolling open terrain. That's why they talk about the Ukrainian steppe, Ukrainian agricultural belts. These places are not the places where you're going to hide very many people. And the dense forests are up in the north, and the mountains are far, far to the west. So the bottom line is that is not practical. And on top of that, of course, you've got Europeans that live around these places, the people that border Ukraine itself, Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Hungary to a lesser extent, and then finally Romania. These states don't want to be drawn into some protracted campaign that will end up with scorched earth to destroy whatever remains. The key right now, though, and this is something else, we continue to ignore the potential for accidents, for problems. Yeah. What happens if a Russian missile strike goes awry? What happens if it lands accidentally just beyond the Polish border or Slovakia or some other place? And this becomes a sort of catalyst for conflict between the United States and its so-called allies in NATO. I don't see any evidence that anybody in NATO is interested in that. We all know the American people are not interested in it. But I think, as you've pointed out previously, we've got a government, you have a government, London does, that seems absolutely determined, for reasons that don't make any sense, to do anything they can to harm Russia.
it seems so evident now because, like you said, like all the common sense things don't make any sense. Like us Canadians, we don't want war there for the people that live there. Neither do the people there. Neither do anybody. We also don't want our tax money sending rocket launchers over there for any reason either, right? Because we have our own issues here. So again, I think you're right. It leaves these questions as to, okay, it's quite clear that Trudeau and Biden and these leaders are funneling money and support, and are Trudeau, who calls this trucker movement fascist, is now saying we're supporting democracy in Ukraine. And the contrast is just laughable. I mean, on our show we always pull things up like that just to show how ludicrous it is. But yeah, there's definitely something that stinks about the whole thing, right?
Well, the other thing is that historically in Europe, great powers have met to sort out these issues. In other words, come to a solution with which everybody can live, because in most cases, the great powers, certainly after Napoleon, were interested in finding ways of avoiding destructive warfare. I cannot imagine any president of the United States, certainly since World War II, who would not have immediately tried to end the conflict by pushing a ceasefire, holding talks. And I think this is ultimately what Kissinger, whether or not you're a Kissinger fan, I'm not necessarily a Kissinger fan, but Kissinger did say, and I think he was correct, we're going to have to negotiate an end to this thing, and territory is going to have to be changed. And frankly, in this part of the world, I can tell you that borders there over the last several hundred years have changed dozens and dozens of times. So this is not a new phenomenon. But the most important thing is to avoid any escalation or any wider expansion of the war in the region that could ultimately lead, as we all fear, to some sort of nuclear exchange that no one in their right mind could possibly want.
Yeah, we've got we've seen tons of videos that they've been using their media propaganda. I mean, Fox News even putting on videos of these guys carrying wooden guns and stuff. I mean, it's almost like it's purposely supposed to be in your face that it's fake. I don't know what they're up to with that. But the United Nations signed a memorandum of understanding with the World Economic Forum that they'd be working together on Agenda 2030, and Russia seems to be a clear opponent of that. And so there's a couple things there that I'm wondering if you have an opinion on, which is that because the United Nations has allied themselves with the World Economic Forum for Agenda 2030, do they see the United Nations needs to work as an arm of NATO to destroy Russia? And could some of these weapons that are being shipped over to Ukraine actually be arming the UN and NATO?
You're asking me things that I don't know enough about to answer. The only thing I can say is that for a very long time, the Russians and, of course, now the Chinese and Beijing, I think Iranians, and I would say large numbers of states like India, Brazil, and others look at the United Nations as an extension of this sort of globalist power elite that is driving the train in Europe, in North America, and certainly in Ukraine. And I haven't talked very much lately about globalism, but this notion of erasing national borders, effectively eliminating national identity, and promoting this globalist agenda economically, socially, politically, seems to be part of what's going on in Ukraine, because Russia has stood its ground and said, no, we are not going to abandon our national identity. We are not opening our borders to anyone that you want to send in. And we're not going to join these organizations that are going to change our laws, our way of life, our culture. So I think that's a big part of what's happening. And if you look at the principal actors in Washington, I can't speak for Canada because I'm not really that familiar with Canadian politics. But if you look at the people driving this thing in Washington, D.C., I saw many of the same people and worked with many of them in the 1990s in the Balkans, where they were pursuing the same kind of aims and the same strategy. In fact, many of them opened their mouths and said, after we've occupied Yugoslavia and put some new government into Belgrade, because they were going to force everyone in Yugoslavia that just fought each other to tear the thing apart. We're going to force you back together so that you can live in this diversity paradise, which is where you belong. then eventually we're going to spread our quote unquote democratic revolution all the way to Moscow. Well, they're at it again. They seem to think that this is what the world should have. They remind me very much of old hardline Bolshevik communists committed to an internationalist revolution.
I mean, we saw that, it seems like, because George Soros tried to get a kind of foothold in Russia, and we've kind of, gone a little bit in depth into exploring that. And, again, this refusal, I guess, of Putin and the Russian people to say, no, yeah, we're all on board for this. And again, just open borders and this ideological idea that, to do away with national sovereignty, I don't think it's going to work. And I think people already are aware of it now and are kind of seeing, maybe the larger hands at play, geopolitically, that, and I think people now, as we're kind of waking up to that, can kind of see that. And I think as people are watching this, situation unfold in Ukraine, I think, certainly lies are being exposed, all the propaganda we were seeing the first few weeks of, the ghost of Kiev and all this, and, all the things that were being exposed. We were having a blast with that. I mean, just showing pictures that were, 10 years old that were being rerun. So, I mean, we're past that, but I think this is just another exposure thing. But I think this is a lot bigger than a lot of people actually understand geopolitically and the ramifications for it, especially with Russia, and China and India in this new Asia infrastructure bank, being really pitted against this, Rothschild banking kind of system that we've had as well, right? I mean, that's a pretty big element to this as well, I think.
Well, the first red flag that came up for me was that I suddenly realized that all of the retired general officers that I had known when I was on active duty, virtually without exception, were leading cheers for the war to destroy Russia, leading cheers for let's bleed Russia to death. The Russian army is falling apart. Russian troops are deserting. The Russians are incompetent. The Russians don't know what they're doing. And what was interesting about that is that I was simultaneously hearing from my contacts on the ground in that part of the world, and they were reporting something very different, completely different. And for some reason, in addition to that, I began to hear British general officers come on and say similar things. And I used to credit them with a little more circumspection in terms of restraint regarding speech and superlatives. They jumped on the Russian hate train as well. So I knew when there was virtual unanimity across the board, there's something radically wrong with this. This doesn't make any sense, because I'm talking to people some of whom are watching it at close range, some of whom are coming out and reporting, some of whom are nearby taking reports, and they're all saying something very different. That no, the Russians are crushing the opponents, but clearly at the opening phase, as I discussed earlier, because of their original intention and underlying assumptions, it was much slower than it was originally expected to be. Mm-hmm. But, I've tried to say to people repeatedly, this is a war Russia can't lose. If we went into Mexico, even if we made every mistake in the book, we would not lose it, because Mexico's on our border. That simplifies your logistics problems. It simplifies rapid reinforcement, a whole range of issues that would confront us overseas instantly go away in Mexico. And the same thing was true for the Russians. But and there's one other aspect that really, really upsets me. How do all of these people reconcile their unconditional support for whatever this Ukrainian government wants to do with this sort of bizarre National Socialist Nazi craziness in many of these Ukrainian formations, certainly the ones that were in Mariupol and some other areas that were linked unambiguously with war crimes going all the way back to 2014. Why did we ever train these people and tell them to wear that insignia and celebrate that sort of thing? We're not talking about somebody who says, look, I like Germans. That has nothing to do with it. This is sick. And how do you justify supporting that? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and Canada actually used the Canadian military to train those guys as well. So it wasn't just CIA; it was actual Canadian military, and we've exposed that here on this show. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you just directly. How bad is Azov Battalion? Like, if it's just one battalion and they're destroyed by Russia, and we don't have to worry about it, and what's the realistic reach of this Nazi resurgence? We know it's big in Ukraine. We know that the globalists themselves espouse a lot of these ideals, but as far as like a ubiquitous threat maybe in the region in Europe, or if it's spread to further regions. Do you have any sense of where this Nazi resurgence has gone, or if it sort of ends with Azov Battalion?
Well, I think it's this phenomenon has deep roots in Ukraine. And most Americans, most people in the West are simply not familiar with the history of the region. They don't understand that from roughly 1929 to 1932, millions of Ukrainians, we estimate probably close to 9 million. You could probably add 2 or 3 million Russians to that total who happen to be in the area as well. But they were systematically starved to death. Those that survived were deported and died during deportation or in work or labor camps in the gulags, or they were shot outright. And the people that led this were from the NKVD, and they used criminals that had been released from jails, as well as volunteers who simply wanted to enrich themselves and saw an opportunity for plunder to go in Ukraine and commit these terrible atrocities. The outcome of this business was that by the time you get to 1941, when the Wehrmacht invades Russia, that there were millions of people welcoming the Wehrmacht as infinitely superior to what they were dealing with at home. And in fact, in most of Eastern Europe, if you had to make a choice between Stalin and Hitler, and that was your choice, most people chose Stalin because Stalin was far more murderous and dangerous. I mean, I interviewed many survivors when I was doing my doctoral work who had lived through the Second World War. And the thing that I heard over and over and over again was, under the Soviets, we starved, there was chaos, they took our land. Under the Germans, there was order, they gave us our land back, and we ate. I mean, it was that simple. So if you were going to make a choice in Ukraine of which way do I turn and to whom do I turn for support, you know, the inclination of most people that were on the side occupied by the Germans was, this is a lot better than what I was dealing with beforehand. All of that is bound up with this. But then you have this other strange phenomenon. You have this oligarch, Kolomoisky, who is behind Zelensky. He's instrumental in having picked Zelensky, brought him to the attention of Newland and others on the American side. And he seems to have invested very heavily in these Nazi units. And he, of course, is Jewish, which I find incomprehensible as well. So do many of my friends in Israel. But the bottom line is this whole thing is sort of a tragic chapter. We should put that to bed. Instead of resurrecting the Second World War and the horrors of that era, we should be burying those permanently. And we should be encouraging a very different outcome. But it seems to me that we have essentially used these experiences and these memories to mobilize hatred and hostility to Russia. Again, we're back to this issue of Russia, destroy Russia. I certainly was anti-communist, and I was quite prepared as a professional soldier to fight the Soviets. But I had plenty of interaction after the Cold War ended. When I say plenty, I mean periodic interaction with Russians and Ukrainians. And I saw no evidence for any communism or any hatred of the West. I saw no evidence for any interest in going to war with us. And anybody who knows anything about the Russian military establishment knows that it's far too small for any major offensive operation against the West. And if you look at their posture, the way they've organized largely to defend Russia. These enormous, lengthy borders that Russia has. None of the things that are imputed to Russia right now make any sense. It's almost as though it's become evil incarnate. And every nation has its weaknesses, its faults, and its flaws. We all agree with that. But this exaggeration of extremism is really off the charts and makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, well, do you think so? The United Nations has largely ignored Russia's genuine evidence of all of the reasons that they had to worry about the Ukraine, going right back to Lindsey Graham and John McCain on camera in 2015 or 16, around the end of 2015, I think, going to Ukraine saying they were going to help the Ukrainians invade Russia all the way back then. And so Russia has brought over 200 documents to the United Nations supporting all the stuff going on in the biolabs and the preparations Ukraine was making to attack Russia. And the United Nations has clearly jumped on this same propaganda bandwagon that, like you're saying, the ex-generals and stuff are talking about against Russia. Do you think that by them clearly ignoring the reality of the situation and throwing their hat in with the World Economic Forum and all these NATO leaders, do you think that this could threaten the United Nations' existence in the future for all the countries that see through what they're doing? Like they might leave?
Well, it's been, 75 years since the end of the Second World War. We're at the end of a very long period, and the institutions that grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War, this thing that you hear about all the time, the liberal world order, or the post-war world order, it's collapsing. It's falling apart. And it's probably appropriate that it should, if for no other reason, because most of the world doesn't want it. We emerged from World War II almost untouched. When I say untouched, I'm talking about our countries, the infrastructure, the industry, the economy. That's why we became the world's great lone superpower for a long time. It wasn't because somehow or another we had outperformed everybody else necessarily, although we have a good record in agriculture and high-end manufacturing and so forth, but it had a lot to do with the fact that everybody else was exhausted. Everybody else was prostrate. Well, the world has recovered. And if you look at the numbers of nations or countries in the world that have declined to participate in the sanctions regime aimed at Russia or in China, and for that matter, others, it's really Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world is largely not interested. Even when you go to Japan, the Japanese said, well, we'll go ahead and sign on for your sanctions. However, we're not going to stop importing Russian oil and gas. We're not going to end our joint exploration and development projects with the Russians in the Sea of Japan and in the Kuril Islands. In other words, fine, we'll do what you want to a point. The other thing is the Japanese and the Chinese for a very long time have been doing business in their own currency with each other, not with the dollar. And you're going to see, I think, now a real rebellion against what I would call dollar dominance. In fact, I think it's already begun. And the most populous nations in the world, India and China, are both utterly opposed to everything that we've been doing towards Russia. So I think we're at a strategic inflection point of gargantuan proportions. The world is about to change dramatically. So this whole US-led, dominated, liberal post-war order is going to end. And never lose sight of the fact that, let's face it, we've printed more money than we should have. We put ourselves in a terrible position. We exported most of our scientific industrial base, our manufacturing capability. And then we've been through this process of throwing open the borders, admitting millions of people. What happens when the inevitable economic downturn comes? What happens when the economy collapses? And I think it's going to. Certainly the financial system's in a lot of trouble. The Fed has clearly lost control. You put all of these things together, and I predict that within 6 months, no one will mention Ukraine at all. It'll be a distant memory because we'll have so many other problems to deal with here at home that we'll simply pull in our horns, if you will. I'd be surprised if we don't withdraw most of our forces. I think you're going to see a huge change, permanent change in the strategic distribution of power in the near future as a result of the things that I just mentioned.
Yeah, so I got a lot of times these guys are kind of like illusionists, where they'll wave the big pink hanky over one side, and you're not supposed to look over here. I'm
Yes.
wondering, because you're so versed in global military activity, is the Ukraine war? Is there any other global conflicts that the Ukraine war is distracting us from that we need to be aware of, that honestly most people don't know about, that we shouldn't forget about?
Well, there are various conflicts in Africa, but they're not of particular importance on the international level. I would say that right now, India, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, no one in Asia is interested in going to war with anybody. Absolutely not. The only people in Asia talking about war are people in Washington, D.C. We're the ones that keep trying to organize this anti-Chinese alliance. And people in Asia understand China. They understand the threat of Chinese economic imperialism. They've lived with these people for thousands of years. It's not a new problem. They do not see China as this great military threat. And I don't think we should either. But the Chinese feel very threatened by us militarily. I think you're going to see that will definitely change the calculus in China vis-a-vis the United States, which is unfortunate. Russia is certainly not interested in going to war with anybody. This whole thing in Ukraine was something they felt compelled to do for their own national security. And I think one of you pointed out that the Ukrainians had strategic aims of attacking Russia. Well, I think that's true. We know there was a large buildup of Ukrainian forces across from these Donbas republics. It looked as though there was a plan to attack the two autonomous republics, bring them to heel, and then eventually turn on Crimea, believe it or not. This is sort of insanity, in my judgment, as well. And so this sort of Russian intervention was, in a way, kind of a preemptive strike to deal with the threat they saw metastasizing. And if they didn't attack it, it would eventually catch up with them. And that's even before you begin talking about the potential to place missiles in eastern Ukraine that we would provide that could reach Russian targets that are important to Russia's nuclear deterrence within a few minutes. All of that was unacceptable. Russians made that very clear. And they've been talking about this for decades. But I think on a global level right now, there may be small brushfire conflicts and wars at various points in time, but truthfully, there's no appetite for a major war right now in Europe or the United States or in Asia. There may be in the future trouble between the Turks and Iran. And I think we'll see more instability in that area, but not on the scale that we created through our interventions in Iraq and Syria.
I think what's becoming really clear too is that, a lot of these things that we are finding unexplainable, and the people that are supporting these things and are coming out and saying these things, it's kind of like this, I don't know if you want to call it the military industrial complex, but it's almost like this group or category of people, I suppose, within the system that you may find, maybe more responsible for the, mess in the Middle East and stuff that was, people were tangled up in, and good men and women went and served, for freedom and for a lot of things that turned out, maybe necessarily weren't exactly, what they thought they were going there for. And I think the same thing's being done now. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, as these people are, I guess, exposing themselves as just, well, why, is this guy supporting this, or why, as things don't make sense, there's only really one conclusion, is that, well, they clearly want these things, and and why is that? And I think we're starting to notice, again, like I was saying earlier, a lot of these, I guess, global players that are kind of seemingly involved in all kinds of different countries, and the overlap. And I think it's this kind of agenda of the different elite groups that are, it's becoming more clear, I guess, as we're watching it, this power struggle that's unfolding across the whole world, but especially in Ukraine, and how it's so intertwined with American politics, and even here in Canada. Our Christina Freeland, our Minister of Finance, we were looking at her, and her mom work was funded by Soros to rebuild their whole judiciary and legal system in the 90s. And that was just incredible to find. It's like, well, that's a weird, coincidence back to Ukraine.
The globalized West has its own oligarchs. Let's be frank, and they are pulling a lot of strings. The interesting part is that we've worked our way into a financial crisis and into an economic one here in the United States that I think is going to end up entrapping all of these people in something they didn't expect. And I don't think things are going to quite work out as they'd hoped. And that's very obvious in Ukraine right now. This thing in Ukraine will end at Russia's convenience, not ours. And the impact globally of this terrible and pointless and stupid war that has killed far too many people for nothing is going to have far-reaching consequences for the United States. In addition to the stupidity of disturbing the grain exports, mineral exports, metals exports, oil and gas exports, and so forth from Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, that's one thing. But for us in the Western Hemisphere, I think we're in for some really tough times in the United States because both Beijing and Moscow now have very little incentive to cooperate with us on much of anything, least of all, as we've asked them in the past, not to support or cultivate hostility to us in Cuba, Venezuela, and Mexico. And that is going to rise up, I think, and present serious, serious trouble for the United States in the years ahead. The Caribbean Basin and Central America are going to become a fertile ground for seeding conflict and hatred and hostility against us. And I'm very confident that Moscow and Beijing will play a major role in that. And it didn't have to be that way, but I think it will be now.
And I think with the leadership, again, in the United States and even here in Canada, it's as they continue to perpetuate, what the situation that's going on in Ukraine, the longer that our economies are getting devastated, and the longer that, we're going to suffer as, the people that actually live here, right? And it's, again, it seems, at least in my own opinion, is that it's the will of these, kind of elitist groups, it's what they want. It's not actually what's best for our country or your country. And again, it seems like they have a bone to pick with Russia. And I think that's, again, it comes down to just this money and infrastructure and, this control that I think they've lost. Because I always knew there was something up with Ukraine, but I don't think a lot of us were aware of how much importance Ukraine is for, all kinds of different, enterprises and money laundering and crime. And so I think as this gets exposed, I think, these individuals are losing the grip that they once had, right? And you can kind of just see them more clearly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that because, Jack took the words right out of my mouth, but that it seems just after the stuff that you told us about that a lot of this is that, Russia, China, and India have been mobilizing against the global financial system that these guys were trying to set up, and now they're using fear of war to get all of us to defend their global financial system through Ukraine to attack Russia. But Russia and China seem like civilizational countries that want their sphere of influence and don't really have the capability of being a major threat to try to take over the world per se.
Or want to. It doesn't seem like they want to. And actually, that's a good thing you mentioned there, Bart, is I think this is what I wanted to mention. I wanted to get your opinion. Is it seemed that like the war that these globalists want, or whomever is behind this media narrative that, Russia is the enemy, like whoever that is, that's up for debate. It doesn't matter. There's clearly somebody paying for that to have all that pushed out, right? So, they wanted the war kind of between the West and Russia, which is what they've been, building for years. And it looks like it's, Russia versus criminal organizations and threats to them, which it seems like is intertwined with this globalist elite. So it's like the war that they wanted, which was, this West versus Russia. I think we can kind of see right through that is that, no, that's not what they're doing. That's not what they're saying they're doing. That's not what it looks like on the ground.
I'm sure that you've heard the question that was raised and directed at the President Biden, that is, saying, are you prepared to intervene to defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack?
Yeah, the blunder.
And he said, yes, we would go to war to do that effectively, which is lunacy. There's a complete failure to understand several things about China. First of all, there are 1.4 billion people living there. Most of them live within 300 to 500 miles of the Pacific Ocean. So what you hear people in much of Asia refer to China as the Chinese banana, because everybody lives right along that coast. The interior is filled almost not at all with people. And the people that you find in the interior in many cases are not really Han Chinese. They're Mongolian, Turkic, and so forth. So that's the first problem. You've got this man Xi who wakes up every morning and has to manage this 1.4 billion person nation and economy. Secondly, he's got to provide them with security, the perception that they can live, eat, sleep securely, and he can protect them from external enemies, and they can enrich themselves and live the good life. China's economy is in a lot of trouble at the moment, probably at least as much as our own, maybe more. It depends upon whom you want to talk to. But if you look at their economy and their supposed 8% growth rate, you start chipping away at this facade and you see, my gosh, there are millions and millions of people that are no longer employed. The idea of several hundred million people who can't find work is a real danger to political, social stability in that country. The Chinese leadership lives to protect the country from that kind of chaos. And then finally, you have us sitting on the outside threatening to do terrible things. But in Taiwan, there are two parties. One party is pro Beijing. That is the old KMT party of Chiang Kai-shek, which for a long time has said, look, we should reunify with China. China is no longer a communist state. By the way, it isn't. We keep emphasizing communist party, but it's really much closer to a Mussolini-style Italian fascist state structure. It's a form of state-controlled capitalism. This structure is actually pretty fragile at the moment, but it's certainly not the kind of thing that people in Taiwan are afraid of. In fact, if you brought Chinese from the mainland, Chinese from Taiwan together, and asked them both, what do you really want? How would you like to live? I think you would find that the overwhelming majority would point to Singapore, which is a fascist state, by the way, if you've ever visited it. It's not the kind of place where most Americans would want to live.
You can go to jail for spitting gum out on the ground in Singapore, right? Yeah.
But it's ideal for the Chinese. They love that order, that certainty, that security. Everyone can make as much money as they want to. No one's going to interfere with them in the pursuit of that goal. It is a Confucian state, not perhaps as much as China, but pretty close. The bottom line, that's really what they want. Now, back to Taiwan. Let's set aside the one party, KMT. Then there's another party. It's pro-Japanese because the Japanese ruled Taiwan for decades. So there aren't ill feelings in Taiwan towards Japan the way there are in China. In fact, Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it was the staging point for virtually all of the Japanese invasions of China. And Taiwan's economy, much like the economy of South Korea, they're both extensions, for all intents and purpose, of the Japanese economy. So now, what is going on in Taiwan? These two parties jockey for power. One says they want to reunify, the other says no. The elections are decided within a few points of each other. But the bottom line is that Taiwan is a powerhouse. It has high-end microcircuitry manufacturing, microchip manufacturing. It's so important to China, Japan, Korea, and even to us. No one in their right mind is going to destroy it. So the idea that China is going to launch this major war to try and destroy Taiwan, which they really don't want to destroy, is ludicrous. It's just not there. And the other thing people forget, you're crossing 100 miles of water. Look at the trouble the Germans had with the English Channel. Now magnify that dramatically. It's much worse trying to cross open ocean from China to Taiwan. This is not an imminent threat, yet everyone in Washington is convinced it's imminent. We have to prepare for it. And of course, that justifies in their minds enormous amounts of money going in to build a World War II style surface fleet, which is the last thing we need anymore, and which makes no technological sense in this age, because virtually anything that floats can be targeted and neutralized without much difficulty. So the bottom line is, if you really want to understand what's happening, you've got to follow the money trail in Washington, D.C., and separate that from whatever the rhetoric is. But take this China-Taiwan dynamic and step back from it, look at it objectively, and the evidence for the horror story that obviously President Biden is preaching and others are preaching, it's just not there. But having said that, making that very imprudent statement, Biden has signaled to the Chinese that we are an existential threat to China. And we're not. We don't need to be. We shouldn't be any more than they should be one to us. But this is where we are now. We have poisoned Moscow, poisoned Beijing. We've poisoned many other countries against us. There are many around the world watching in utter disbelief at our behavior. I keep wondering, how much longer will the Germans, the Italians, the French, the Spaniards put up with this? At some point, they must see that the policies we are imposing on them are promoting conflict and crisis that they don't need in their lives.
Yeah, the evidence we're seeing is that the stomach of the public has already turned on the people who are in power making the decisions. There's not a lot of support in the United States for all the stuff that Joe Biden's up to. NATO is throwing around a lot of threats, and I think in the United States, a lot of people are talking about this. I think most countries recognize that this is the case, and with the Sweden-Finland thing going on about joining NATO, American voters are realizing, and here in Canada, I mean, I think it's also a fact that that NATO is basically looting the United States economy for their own defense. But the entire strength of NATO is also dependent on the strength of the United States military, with almost nobody else factoring in materially. So my question to you is, how much has the Joe Biden presidency weakened the U.S. military? Like, where's it actually at? We know Donald Trump actually built it up, but has Joe Biden significantly diminished the United States military and its capabilities?
Well, let's go back to the NATO bit, because something very entertaining occurred here in Washington, D.C. last week. The Swedish ambassador, she's a very lovely person, said that the Swedes were happy to join NATO because they've been investing 4% of their gross national product in the Swedish military. And if they join NATO, they can cut that in half and only invest 2%.
Right.
In other words, they can join the other military dependencies on the continent, the other states that have decided to mortgage their security and their future to the promise of American military protection. The Finns, who are wonderful people, and I also like the Swedes very much. The president of Finland, when he said, yes, we're going to join NATO, and that's because you, Mr. Putin, invaded another sovereign country. You know, I think he's mischaracterizing that, but nevertheless, he said that, and he said, then he was asked, well, are you afraid of the Russians? He said, no. Are you worried about a Russian threat or threat of invasion? No. The truth is that people in Europe know the Russians aren't invading Western Europe. That's a lot of nonsense. There's no interest in that. Putin has no interest in that. Putin wants to do business, and that's going to fall apart. But this question of the Europeans' dependence on us and how much longer that goes on, I think as we become more strapped for cash, frankly, we'll be less able to do what we've done in the past, and there will be a greater awareness that they cannot just mortgage their freedom and their security to us in perpetuity. Now, when it comes to the U.S. military, I think the U.S. military has been in serious decline since 1991. Desert Storm was kind of a peak in American military power, and then we set about dismantling it very rapidly. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't spend on it, but spending money on elaborate or luxurious weapon systems, increasing the numbers of headquarters and general officers, buying platforms that are versions of what you had before that are simply more expensive with more exotic bells and whistles, those things don't necessarily produce real military power. So we've been, in my judgment, on the downslide for many years. And the last 20 years, it simply accelerated the process because we had to shift away from the normal focus of true warfighting, if you will, true combat operations, in favor of combating insurgencies in wars of occupation of peoples that didn't want us in their country. And that sapped our strength. And then we have engaged in all of these social engineering programs involving women and now different kinds of people with different sexual preferences, and add to that this new enthusiasm for dividing people on the basis of race, which many of us worked very, very hard for decades to overcome. And I think our armed forces are demoralized and in poor condition. But bear in mind, the people that are at the top of the military establishment now are products of the last 30 years of selections. And the left has controlled the government even through the years of George Bush. Anybody who thinks that George W. Bush was some sort of right-wing conservative is a lunatic. There wasn't much difference between the Bush presidency, the Clinton presidency, not much difference from Bush to Obama. Yep. The disruptor was Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump came in. He was a real estate man. He had a lot of business experience, knew nothing about Washington. And it caught up with him because he never understood the need to completely clear out the bureaucracy and to bring in fresh people, fresh blood. In fact, it's gotten so bad in Washington, if they say, oh, well, we really like Joe or Jane, they're great people, and that's exactly the person you want, you probably ought to run like hell to get away from them.
Yeah.
Because they're exactly the wrong people, because that means they've signed on for this corruption.
Yeah. It seems like everything's that way, even with the medical advice they give out. It's like, I feel like I should be doing the opposite at this point with the track record of, that's a whole nother thing to get into, but I think it's really exposing, though, these people that are, I guess, using our systems of democracy and that maybe have infiltrated them, over the last 20 years. It's really exposing them for who they are. It's exposing who these people are that have, made a fortune off of crashing our economy, multiple times. And the people that, make money off of, pushing credit debt. And it all seems to be the same people when you follow the money, right? And I think they're really losing a grip on, I think as people are aware of who they are, it's like this veil is lifted. Like they've lost this anonymity, yes. Where people, you don't know who they are. So, they've always kind of been in the background. But a lot of these problems that we're experiencing, even this so-called food shortage crisis, it's like, our Ontario premier, he shut down 36 trucking companies because of the trucker convoy thing, in a matter of a week. And it's like, well, that's not going to help this food shortage thing. So, it's just so clear who's working for, this globalist or this agenda, whatever it is. It's clearly not for the people or for what, the majority I feel actually want. But I think it's just becoming so clear now, the longer these things are drawn out.
You were talking about Trudeau, and a friend of mine reminded me of something about Prime Minister Gordon Brown in Great Britain. They had a clip that I think you can probably still find it on the internet, although, that's iffy these days, given the way the left polices the internet. But nevertheless, he was speaking, he was running for re-election, I guess. And he ran into this woman in England, and I'm not sure where, but it was a major city. It could have been Manchester or any number of different places. But she said, Mr. Prime Minister, we're really having a lot of trouble here. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, we have all these foreigners coming into the country and we have no room for them and we don't want them here. And some of them are taking jobs. Most of them, though, are causing criminal action. They're causing crimes and on. And he listened to her and he was polite. Then he turned to get back into his car. And as he was getting in, he turned to the woman and said, that woman's just a racist, a terrible racist. I think there's this attitude in the elites across the West. They all seem to be cut from a similar cloth. They all went to the same universities. They're very taken with themselves. They're very confident of their superiority over everyone else. They seem to think that they've captured the truth, that they have a monopoly on it, and that everyone else is supposed to listen intently as they did when they were at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and take whatever they say as gospel. And so if you don't, then you are on the list.
Yeah, they're trying to make it
tourists. Your mouth and you challenge any of this, that's what's happened to you. Are people in Canada beginning to figure out that this goes on and this is meaningless?
Yeah. People are figuring it out. Just like the United States. I mean, the independent media has become public enemy number one because we're crushing them. As far as
Yeah.
the
Like,
politically motivated and are finding the right information
I mean,
because
and we
they're
just, yeah, like we see things and we laugh. Like, this is like shooting fish in a barrel. Like, it's at this point, there is now enough people awake and organizing that I think the tides are shifting. Like, even our show here, right? We're just pulling up articles and saying this is completely false. This is what the truth is. And I think as the lies are exposed, it's been so quick since the trucking convoy because people didn't buy it, that these Canadians that are out there with their kids having a good time are these, it just doesn't, it's not true at all. And that just kind of woke up so many people here, is
it,
that
it woke
didn't
up the
line
world
up with
too.
reality.
I got one more question I want to get in, just if your time allows, and then
Sure.
I just wanted to ask because as these guys get crazier and more desperate that are at the top of politics, is there a disconnect with the military that may disobey the executive branch? Is there like some kind of safety valve where if they try to pull something too crazy, do you think the military is just going to say no?
I would say about the American military that, again, the majority of the people that are at the top are indistinguishable from the people at the top of the political structure. In other words, these aren't tough, hard bitten military professionals. These are bureaucrats in uniform, sycophants who know how to cultivate superiors, and they essentially ingratiated themselves to their superiors who were on the left, clearly over the last 30 years, and they demonstrated their readiness to effectively obey unconditionally any dumb order or any dumb policy. And they did that because they looked and rapidly concluded that if anybody stood up and said, "No, wait a minute, we don't think it makes a lot of sense to put small numbers of young women into combat formations that are going to be thrown at the enemy on the battlefield. This is disruptive. It's dangerous. The women are going to be killed. The women are at risk of all sorts of things. And the men will be too focused on the women instead of doing their jobs." I mean, just go down the list. Anybody who said those things, they were out. They were immediately identified for expulsion. So there isn't much credibility at the top with the people at the lower end. So the real question is, what are the people in the units and the formations going to do? And there I have some more bad news. Some of the very best people that we had who did exactly what you mentioned earlier, who gave everything they had in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, finally discovered that this is a scam. I'm not going to do this anymore. And they got out. So I don't know, frankly, that you could expect somebody to stand up and say no to much of anything. On the other hand, I also don't think it's a very effective warfighting force. Anything that requires you to do more than push a button and launch a missile is going to be a hazardous affair, because we have bred the killing capability out of the force in many cases. So it's not a good picture.
I think it's like, from what I've seen, is like I remember there were some Navy SEALs or something, like people have taken it upon themselves to fight, mandates and stuff. And I think a lot of the success is from grassroots movements, like really people taking it upon themselves to do something, and then that, inspiring others to do it. But I mean, I think what you were saying is this, when you were saying how people would be removed if they were questioning, common sense things like, deployments on the battlefield. It seems like they've been doing that at a faster pace, even within the military and medical. And if anybody goes against this kind of left-wing agenda,
Yes.
far left, you're kind of outed. And I think it seems to me, at least, that this is kind of these same people slowly kind of infiltrating, just based on the fact that if anybody was against this, then they would have been, even removing themselves or quitting or something, right?
The issue is that the people that were willing to stand up, that had real backbone, were made examples of. In other words, they were removed. They were passed over. They were expelled. See, there's nobody left in the senior ranks that's going to stand up for much of anything. What you're going to get are people that are echo chambers. They're just going to echo whatever they hear from the political side. They're going to sign on or whatever dumb, stupid idea comes down the road. And my concern is that when you go to the people who actually do the fighting, the soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, warrant officers, many of the very best have said, that's it, I've had it. I'm not going to serve in this anymore. The numbers of senior non-commissioned officers with experience who've said, the devil with this, I'm on my way out, is huge. That's not a good thing. Now, can it be repaired? Yes, but it takes years to build effective military power. And we haven't done a very good job of that. What we've done is sort of hang bells and whistles on the old World War II structure in perpetuity. It's sort of like we're going to get a new Christmas tree, only next year it's going to have electric lights, but it's still the old Christmas tree. It's still the old Ford. We gave it a new paint job. Yeah, we fixed the engine a little bit. It's still the old thing. We're at a point now where we really need to make sweeping change.
Yeah.
So again, to go back to my point to you guys earlier, I really think, and this is what scares the globalists, this is what scares the people in Washington, that we are on the edge, or at the on the threshold, if you will, of profound change after 75 years of a status quo that's effectively collapsing around us, political, social, military, economic, everything. And a new status quo is going to have to be forged. It's going to be forged with great difficulty in the context of some upheaval that's coming. But the past is going to die. It's already dying in front of us. And we're going to have to build something new. We're not going to be able to revive the patient. What we've been doing is treating all the problems that we have in the United States like a heart patient. And everybody walks in and says, well, I think we'll get the heart patient a new haircut. Oh, let's give him a shave. Well, let's change his bedclothes. Nobody wants to go in and say, let's give him a new heart. But that's what he needs.
Right.